Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You need this. You need some pepper spray. In case you don't like the way things are going on, just spray some of this in people's face. Stacy Herbert, tell us more.
Max, of course you're referring to the police pepper spraying students at UC Davis, the occupiers there, University of California, Davis. And the headline on this newspaper, police suspended over pepper spray attacks that shocked U.S. And I thought it was a good parallel to what's going on in the global economy, that we have these unelected officials imposed upon us and pepper spraying us with equally, as they describe it here, pepper spray is a toxic red liquid. Instead, we have toxic debts sprayed upon us, and yet nobody is being fired or suspended over this.
Yeah, you're supposed to stay out of the red if you're running an economy. You're not supposed to spray redness or debt into an economy, as we see happening now in the Eurozone with these unelected bankers who go by the code name technocrat, but that's just code for bankster, and they go in there with their aerosol of debt and they spray it into these economies. And of course it destabilizes these economies even more, and it requires more austerity measures, and it requires the confiscation not only of wealth but of civil rights.
Let's see how this pepper spraying of debt works. And you might want to pepper spray me now while I'm reading it, just to see if I'm able to tolerate the pain. Taxpayer to carry the risk for private mortgages. If you could see through the haze of pepper spray, the taxpayer is to become the ultimate guarantor for hundreds of millions of pounds of mortgages as part of a radical strategy to boost Britain's ailing housing industry. So by taking some of the risk of lending, the government hopes to bring down deposits of up to 20% for first-time buyers to as little as 5%, and to kickstart demand for homes.
Look, if the taxpayer is the backstop and the guarantor, maybe the taxpayer should elect somebody to run the country that has their interests at heart, and not the interest of the people who are putting together these false agglomerations of illegal debt. You know what I'm saying? If they're going to be the backstop and they're guaranteeing the debt, then shouldn't they have somebody in office who's there for their interest? How can they allow for someone to be parachuted in from a banker to serve the banker's interest, to set it up so that when the bankers fail, then the taxpayer, the citizen, has to be the backstop?
He's also helping developers out. So housing developers, the article says, will also be able to bid for up to £400 million of government subsidies to start work building on land which the developers already own but consider currently uneconomical to develop. Isn't this what a market is, Max? Price discovery mechanism, all that stuff?
Right. Well, the way to cure the housing problem in the UK is to let the market determine where the price should be that would stimulate demand. So by Cameron coming in and gifting developers with huge cash gifts to go out there and manipulate the market is only going to, A, make the developers rich in an unhealthy way that we saw in Ireland. Look at all the developers in Ireland who walked away with billions of euros because they were crooked and corrupt. Same thing with the housing developers in the UK. They are pretty much across the board completely corrupt. So the Cameron is just going to give them a free gift. They're just like the banks. They won't actually use it to build housing in a sustainable way. They'll use it to pay themselves huge bonuses and walk away. And then 5 years from now, Cameron will be in the exact same position he was. And if you look what they have done with the rail system. Every 5 years, the transportation system needs a bailout. They give it to private contractors who steal the money. 5 years later, nothing's better, and they give them another gift. So now they're using the same ridiculous methodology that's bankrupted the country, and they're going to apply it from the transportation industry, and they're going to try it now in the housing industry because it works so well in transportation. Now we're going to try it in housing and completely and systemically and institutionally totally corruptify that part of the economy.
Corruptify? Is that a
Corruptify!
Well, but it's also, you know, how democracy can work as a tyranny against everybody else. Because in the UK especially, you only need something like 23% of the vote, the popular vote, and you become prime minister. Here he's helping out a select group of people who could even come up with the 5%, because average house prices in the UK are still £232,000, which is like you could buy Beverly Hills for that.
Absolutely. They think the problem is not with the prices themselves as it would relate to a free market capitalist system. They perceive the problem to be that the additional layers of an enormous Ponzi scheme is missing, that the government will supply because the private sector is too broke to provide that next layer of a Ponzi scheme. This will result in further market dislocation. The house prices will never find a point of equilibrium that would be equivalent to a free market system. And Cameron clearly is pandering to his constituency to try to stay in office because everything else he touches turns to complete junk. He's got the reverse Midas touch.
Well, listen to what another article on the same story. First-time buyers could get government-backed 95% mortgages. So listen to his arguments. Out goes free market capitalism, that the market should determine what the price is. And listen to the airy-fairy middle class or lovey class sort of targeted language. It's not just about the economy, it's also about people's hopes and dreams. You always remember that moment, if you've done it, when you get that key and you walk into your first flat. It's a magic moment. It's a moment I want everyone in this country to have, not just better off people. The dream of home ownership is something that should be achievable for everyone.
And if you take that speech and you put it word for word and match it up against what Jim Jones told the folks in Guyana shortly before they drank the Kool-Aid, it reads note for note exactly the same. We're talking about cult leaders leading a home ownership cult over the abyss into financial suicide. Let me explain something to you for a second. Capitalism without bankruptcy is like Christianity without hell. I mean, you've got to accept the total package. If you're going to be a free marketeer, you've got to accept that people go bankrupt. That's the way you weed out the weaklings. Or don't call yourself capitalist and go on the perpetual David Cameron merry-go-round of free giveaways for the kleptocrats while austerity measure for everybody else, but we're supposed to feel good because somebody's got a speech that they stole from Jim Jones down there in Guyana.
Okay, he announces this plan just as this headline breaks. Property asking prices cut by most in 4 years. House sellers have cut their asking prices by the largest amount for 4 years as the relentless flow of bad economic news damages confidence, according to the latest figures from Rightmove.
That's the way you clear an inventory. You drop the price, and then people can afford it because it's at the new market price, the new reality. Cameron, how about that for a turn of phrase down there at the dispatch box in the House of Commons? Reality! I know it's a freaky term that they didn't teach you at Eton, but maybe you should read up on it. It's called reality. And you obviously don't live anywhere near that neighborhood. You live in cuckoo land, where you can stimulate the economy with free grift to housing developers who are known assassins, known financial crooks. What the hell, man? Are you out of your mind?
Well, average asking prices had dropped by £7,528 or 3.1% from the previous month. So that's a better way to help people get on the so-called housing ladder rather than take from somebody else. He's having to take from somebody else in the economy, and as we covered when we were in London, he cut it from the poor and the disabled. So some paraplegic right now is being thrown out on the street, so somebody who might vote, who can vote, is going to vote for David Cameron instead.
Right, your point is well taken. He's moving assets from one part of the economy to subsidize the housing industry, which he has identified as key to growth in Britain. Why? Because of that stupid cockamamie speech you just read me that is like playing the violins in the background about every frickin' middle-class, idiotic British person wants to have a home as their castle, and I'm the government, I'm going to make it happen. It's like George Bush retread. Remember his speech, the ownership society? Cameron, you're 10 years too late. That ship has sailed. You can't just replay old George W. Bush speeches and expect people to applaud as if you're saying something A, original, B, truthful, C, sane.
And in the remaining minutes we have here, Max, I want to turn to this little bit of audio to show the nature of the people we're bailing out, who we're all suffering for. And this is Eric Townsend. He's an American investor living in Hong Kong. And he's talking to Financial Sense NewsHour about an account that he had, a commodities account, where they started liquidating his account, even though he was perfectly hedged. And they started liquidating his account due to an obscure rule they say that was in his contract.
And it really makes me wonder, is this stuff designed to protect them in some way, because every action they took increased risk to me and it increased the risk to them? Or is it intended so that a customer's account can blow up according to a complex set of rules that the customer can't possibly inform themselves of? What is the point of all this? Why does it work this way?
Yeah, like I've been saying, I mean, the way the industry is not regulated is a lot of dead bodies are floating to the surface, and whether it's the MF Global scandal or other related scandals, now this scandal, the fact is that these brokerage and bankers, they're simply taking money directly out of people's accounts as the global economy continues to suffer from the deleveraging that's happening as a result of all the fraud to begin with. And I think anyone who has money in any of these institutions, be prepared to lose it.
Well, he's lost $200,000 and he says he's never going back into a commodities brokerage again. And he did ask, why hasn't John Corzine been arrested? What is he doing walking around a free man? So I want to turn to this final headline here, Max. We keep on turning to where all the power is going and is heading east. China applies five-finger death touch to another business fraudster. So former President Shen Changfu of China Mobile Telecom was sentenced to death on charges of taking bribes of over 36 million renminbi, which is around $6 million. Then, Max, on November 17th, his son was sentenced to 10 years in prison for taking bribes of $2 million. Now, this is the killer sentence here. In this case, the son was sentenced for using his father's connections to support getting new contracts for companies. He was then paid dividends by the companies. So just by using his own father's connections. Now you think of David Cameron's entire cabinet and all that they have behind them. They have no work experience, no credibility, no intelligence or know-how. All they have is that they were part of the Lucky Sperm Club.
If they were complying with China's standard of moral rectitude, they would also all be five-fingered to death. So you have to ask yourself, where would you rather have your money? In David Cameron's jizz shack, where it's all vaporizing out the window because he's a nincompoop? Or China, where people actually kill the malcontents? Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away, much more coming your way, so stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Portland, Oregon, and speak with Gregor McDonald of Gregor.us. Gregor is now also writing for Chris Martinson's newsletter. Gregor McDonald, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks so much for having me, Max. Good to see you.
All right, Gregor, with war, bank runs, and political crazies in the news, many have missed that oil was back up over $100. How is oil at $100 a barrel when we are in the midst of a great global deflation?
In the near term, I think that we may have just seen oil prices make their last hurrah for the great reflationary period that started in 2009 and clearly is probably finishing up now in 2011. Even though I think that oil prices will probably weaken from here, I do think that whatever level they go down to will probably be much higher than what we saw in the 2009 financial crisis. We've had no growth in crude oil supply for the sixth year now. And really the way the world has coped with that is by taking more and more demand out of the developed nations of Europe and the United States so that Asia, with its growth in demand, could actually have some oil. So, yeah, we're flat, Max, for the last 6 years.
All right, so a couple of points. First of all, I guess that is the definition of peak oil. And number two, what do you mean it's moved over to Asia? In what capacity? How does that work exactly?
Oil supply is now a zero-sum game. 100% of the growth in Asian demand has been composed of simply freeing up oil consumption from here in the West. I mean, for example, if we look at petroleum consumption in the United States, around peaks of 2005, 2006 at the top of the housing bubble when we were building lots of houses and people were buying pickup trucks and light vehicles. Oil demand here in the United States is down almost 13% in that period, and we're not recovering our demand. We've removed a lot of discretionary demand. Obviously, we had a lot of wasteful discretionary demand to move out, and of course, as our economy fails to recover, maybe we're about to remove another tranche of demand here in the United States.
Now, Gregor, I see a lot of activity in the U.S. With this fracking. This, they go into the geological crust and they crack it open and they release natural gas. And is this a meaningful amount of new supply to the energy mix overall?
It is a meaningful contribution to new supply, and many of us have watched the growth of new tight oil from places like the Bakken Formation in North Dakota for a couple of years now. What's been a little bit comical, however, is to see the press in both London and New York talk about this new supply, not in net terms, however, because the United States has seen an uptick in overall production of about 8 to 10% from its recent lows in 2008. But that hasn't changed global supply, the aggregate global supply of oil. So, I think it's wonderful for the smaller independent oil and gas companies of the United States that production has come back to onshore. They'll certainly see higher production and higher profits. But that doesn't mean that the United States on a net basis is going to go through a significant supply growth period over the next decade, say out to 2020.
Now, here's a straight up and down economics question for you. What's cheaper, for the U.S. to develop alternative energy or to continue invading other countries like Somalia, Yemen, Libya, Iraq, Sudan, or supporting these countries to get oil? What's cheaper, the current foreign policy or developed technological alternative sources?
That's a fairly easy question. I mean, just to put that in context, America built out its highway system after World War II on $14 oil. We're now trying to run that system and repair that system and maintain that system on $100 oil. It's very uneconomical. And from an energy standpoint, it might even be an energy sink. In other words, the amount of resources we're putting into that system may be more than the amount of economic benefit that we're actually getting back out of it. And the problem is liquid energy, Max. That's the real problem. Racing around the world trying to secure new liquid energy resources has become an economic loser for the United States. We would be much better off investing in the power grid and plugging various sources, not just solar and wind, into that new power grid, but also natural gas. We do have decent natural gas resources here in North America. So, your question's pretty easy to answer. Also considering the fact we don't even price in the cost of security, the cost that we incur to maintain our global military presence, which if you look at a map of global military presence, we're dispersed throughout the world, but the main concentration is in the Middle East near oil resources. So that's not a mistake.
Right. Now, let's talk about Japan for a second. And I was just reading that Warren Buffett, in the wake of the Fukushima disaster and the moribund markets over there, is going to take a little field trip from Omaha to Tokyo looking for bargains. Is this a good idea of Warren Buffett's to go look for bargains in this area, or is this economy, because its dependency on oil and the changes in macroeconomic, really not such a bargain?
The Fukushima disaster revealed that Japan is really running on what's known as a very tightly coupled energy system, and tightly coupled systems tend to collapse when you break off just one little part of them. And when the Fukushima and other nuclear complexes went down, you had tremendous strains on the rest of the Japanese energy system. And of course, Japan's manufacturing a lot of its goods through the electrical grid and through the importation of liquefied natural gas. So Japan, I think, has been a bit of a value trap for value-oriented investors for 2 decades. Yes, they do have productive capacity and a very high world-class productive capacity, but Japan is not bringing any other advantage to the table in terms of energy inputs. They're having to pay the highest prices in the world for liquefied natural gas. In fact, I was just looking at liquefied natural gas prices for Japan. They're between $15 and $17 per million BTU. And of course, how do we price the cost to the quality of life in Japan of the Fukushima disaster, which is a event that is going to have ripple damage over several decades. So I think that Warren Buffett, very nice guy, had his golden age in a particular, distinct era of global growth. I think that Warren has perhaps run out of ideas at this point, and it's not really Warren's fault. The world has changed. We're in a phase transition with energy, and I just don't think that Warren's perspective is as valid now as it used to be.
All right, now, Gregory, you mentioned this phrase tightly coupled, which I guess another analogy to this would be that just-in-time supply chain management, that's
right.
Part of globalization. Everyone's all hooked up and moving around, and the transportation system and all the parts and assembly is all happening linked together, very tightly coupled, I guess you could say. Now, with Japan, obviously, being an island and whatnot, you could see how they would be exposed to this tightly coupled economic backdrop. What are some of the other countries that are similarly, let's call it a risk, let's call it tightly coupled risk? As the world deleverages, as globalization, I think we have peak globalization as we have hit peak oil and peak water. So what are some of the other countries that are at risk of tightly coupled disintegration risk?
I think the other system that, of course, remains way too tightly coupled is, of course, the financial system within the OECD nations, and that's principally the United States and Europe. While it's true that the United States has fairly decent energy resources if you don't count oil, I mean, we're pretty well stocked with coal and with natural gas. Europe looks particularly vulnerable in that regard. And it's somewhat tragic or ironic in some sense, because Europe perhaps has done one of the better jobs over the last 2 decades of becoming energy efficient. In other words, they have continually weaned from the demand side their consumption of oil, and have continually moved towards natural gas and solar and wind. But as you saw post-2008, even Europe took another leg down in its petroleum consumption, losing another 1 million barrels per day. And so one of the vulnerabilities that I see with Europe is there isn't as much discretionary energy consumption to shed at this point. And so any leg lower in energy consumption is going to be correlated basically 1-to-1 with economic growth. And of course, this is the really tough spot that the developed world is in right now. It needs to find some way to grow to service the debt. And the barriers to growth are twofold. One, debt in the private sector remains way too high. And two, there just isn't an easy, cheap energy resource coming along to rescue us. And so you're in a very vulnerable type of threshold situation with what's occurred with debt in the developed world.
Right. So although Europe has been cutting back on their consumption of oil, the fact is that the oil industry over the past 25 years has had a reciprocal growth arrangement with the credit markets, and those banks in Europe are exposed to those credit markets in a big way. So even though they've cut back on oil, the collapse in the credit markets is pressuring the banks anyway. So they went through the exercise of cutting back. Really, they're finding out that they're just as exposed to the global credit oil cycle, regardless of whether they cut back.
That's correct. We're sort of trapped below a ceiling. The image of a ceiling is very useful here. Every time these Western economies try to get their head above a ceiling and try to hook into some sort of industrial growth to get the credit cycle restarted again and to get debt service going again, oil rises back up again because it's concurrent with any sort of growth, whether it's production growth or consumption growth. As I said, Max, I think we've just seen the turning point in that cycle. West Texas Intermediate crude came up very quickly in the last 4 weeks because it finally was released from its landlocked status in the interior of the United States and is making its way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And so West Texas Intermediate crude is rejoining with Brent, which is the global grade of oil that the world has paying the price for Brent in the last year. So I think, yes, oil prices have just briefly come up above $100 a barrel, but I just don't think that given the levels at which we're operating at, that our economies are going to be able to sustain that. So I think it's probably time to see a weakening phase in oil prices.
All right, Gregor McDonald, we're out of time. Thanks again for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Gregor McDonald. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Also, follow me on Twitter at Keiser Report or on Facebook, Keiser Report as well. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.